Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
Good morning. Let's begin by introducing ourselves. My name's Paul.
My name's Bob. My name's Randy.
I'm George.
Paul. Kirsten. Jim. Roy. Peter. David. Marty.
Peter.
Art. Snake. Paul. Lon.
Donald.
Allie. Cassie. Today's all Rothberg. Some of you remember Donald was my bass teacher, based in the program operated under the auspices of the Buddhist Fellowship. And Kevin Smith is now head of the East Coast University 2 weeks ago. Donald also teaches at Saybrook Institute. He teaches the graduate school there. He leads Buddhist retreats. He's going to say something about this East Bay Dharma Center. He's trying, you're involved with the institution, is that correct? And Don has also been to clown school.
Blew my cover. Thank you, Paul. I actually was hesitating on. I have a emerging clown persona. My clown name is Garbanzo Bean, and I have an emerging clown persona named Guru Garbanzo Bean, who answers any question, usually unsatisfactorily. I was wondering whether to have that persona appear here, and I decided not to. But possibly it's an irrepressible part of me that may appear despite my attempts at control. Anyway, and thank you for the introduction, Paul. I'll just mention a few other things. I do work a lot with Buddhist Peace Fellowship, and teach both meditation in a more traditional sense, and also teach socially engaged Buddhism, often with Diana Winston, who I believe comes here from time to time. She's been here recently.
I saw her recently.
Yeah. And so, for example, we're doing a 5-day retreat at Spirit Rock in September on, we're calling it Transforming Ourselves, Transforming the World. So it's been an interest of mine to really connect individual practice with social change, basically. And in fact, I just finished doing a piece, which also might come up in discussion. I just finished doing a piece for Tricycle for their election issue in September. And it was called, somewhat paraphrasing Thich Nhat Hanh, Present Moment, Urgent Moment. Subtitled Buddhist Practice in the Current Political Situation. So that may come up, maybe that can come up in the discussion, but should I leave some time for announcements at the end? A few minutes at the end. So the theme I wanted to talk about, though, really is related both to the current political situation and to the act of clowning. And I won't make the obvious possible connections, which are a little somber to contemplate. But the theme I want to explore is really about a kind of balance in practice that I think we don't usually talk about in this way, but it's for me, one of the core ways to look at our practice. And it's particularly relevant, I think, for today, for the Gay Pride Day and the March, and whatever that means to you. I know people have different sets of feelings and reflections related to everything. But so the theme concerns a real balance of practice. And it's a balance between cultivating two kinds of abilities or qualities. The first is the ability to enter difficulties, to go into difficult states of mind, states of heart, and to become really more and more competent in doing that. We could say that that's really a core gift of this practice, to be able to do that. And on the other hand, we cultivate joy. I think maybe this day really reflects both the recognition of the challenges and the difficulties, and also the deep commitment to express joy in the midst of everything, in the midst of all that's happening. And I want to talk about our practice in terms of those two qualities, which I think are really important to balance each other. You know, if we just focus on the difficulties, we can get somewhat dried up and really kind of lose the sense of why we're really practicing or even living. We can get so focused on the difficulties. And so the cultivation of joy is often really an important balance. On the other hand, if we don't have the capability to go into the difficulties, the joy can be more superficial and even escapist in certain way. And so we have to have that ability to do both. So I want to talk, first of all, about the quality of entering difficulties, then about the quality or the competence of cultivating joy, and lastly, talk briefly about what it might look like to have both of them operating together, which is really kind of sort of the mature integration of both of them. So that's my exploration today. And I was really led to think about this question initially because of a question that I remember from a very dear friend. And she, being a very sensitive soul, had the ability to go into both of these states, that sometimes she'd be so sensitive to the pain of the world that it was hardly understandable how there could be joy. And sometimes she would be so sensitive to the beauty and the joy that, it was like where, the difficulties and the pain seemed like illusions in certain ways. And sometimes she was sensitive to both, and she would sometimes talk and ask me, how can there be such beauty and such pain at the same time? How can there be that in our lives and in the world? And it really, I think, is the kind of question that may have come to each of us at certain times. It's a question that I think we can help clarify by really talking about these two abilities. And I think it's also something that comes deeply from the teachings and the nature of the Buddha. That sometimes in hearing the teachings, we may focus on the Four Noble Truths, which are really centered about suffering, aren't they? I think, the first truth is the reality of suffering. The second is the cause for the suffering and some kind of compulsive, unconscious grasping or pushing away. And the third is the possibility of peace. And then the fourth is how to transform the suffering. And sometimes in Indian traditions generally, there's a tendency to express teachings through the negative. So if we look at the precepts, they're primarily focused on what you should be careful about doing. And yet the Buddha was also known as the happy one. There's a kind of radiance there, and sometimes we just may look at the teachings about suffering, but I think both are really present. the first theme, or the first part of this balance about entering difficulties, may be what attracted you to Buddhist practice. There's a sense that I think is really revolutionary, that difficulties are workable, or at least potentially workable. Maybe not immediately, but that we don't have to, in a way, run from the pain. It's not really a message we get in Western culture very much. What's the message we get in Western culture, at least at this time in the evolution or devolution of the society? The message is basically that when you have pain, you use drugs of some kind or another. Just to cover over the pain, whether it's physical or emotional, it's to whatever. Eat food, drink, watch television, shop. The most recent message in extreme social pain, the message from the leader was to shop, which was really did not reflect a mature integration of Buddhist practice. But there's something about the practice when we just sit here, we sit on the cushion, and we learn how to be with the simplest of transient pains. We learn how to be with the knee pain or the less transient pains, or with emotional pain. And we learn that difficulties can be workable, that there's a way in which we're conditioned to not want to be with them. And it's amazing in practice just to watch the lengths that we will go to avoid experiencing something painful. Whether it's an ant crawling on one's nose during practice, or we don't really have them quite out here, but I did a lot of my formative years of practice on the East Coast and sitting in a meditation hall with mosquitoes. I mean, I think people fear mosquito bites more than death sometimes. But just to watch how my mind would be with simple physical pain, and it's a really important part of the training to see the conditioning that we have and to learn how to be present, to learn how to be more present with what's difficult. There's a certain point in practice which I think reflects a certain kind of maturity when our difficult moments or our suffering, especially our smaller sufferings, actually become interesting. In which we actually say, oh, I'm starting to lose it. A time for practice. A moment for practice. It's actually a shift can happen when we take that perspective. One of my early practices that I did with the first teacher I had was Joseph Goldstein. And Joseph gave, early on in my practice, a kind of I don't know if you call it a mantra, but he gave me a phrase or a slogan to work with. It was, if there's suffering, where's the attachment? And something in me really loved that, because I could say, oh, are you suffering? It seems like it. Yes, I'm suffering. Where's the attachment? It was kind of inquiry to look for what was beneath the suffering. And that's something one can do with one's difficulty. There's also a way that we can just go into it. Can be, if I'm having a moment of where I think that something really isn't right, or sometimes if I get too busy, I don't feel like I'm meeting responsibilities, and at 3 a.m. I wake up and say, blew it this time. And usually, a lot of the suffering, I guess we tend to have different styles, but a lot of our styles when we're suffering is to be down on ourselves and to start the voices of self-judgment moving. Do you know that? Do you know those voices? And it's a chance when we're having that suffering to really look out, say, okay, I'm starting to suffer, I'm losing my balance. Can I look out for those different voices and not simply be the prey, as it were, of those voices? And so it's this really powerful moment in practice when we become conscious. I'm entering a difficult moment. It's time to be attentive. It's time to be watchful. Mindfulness is said to be a guardian, a protector. It protects us from the unconscious material just ruling our lives, really. And so this quality of being able to work with the difficulties, and even at certain points appreciate the difficulties because we know we're about to learn something. What a different twist from the original conditioning that we get growing up. A difficulty is happening, I'm suffering some. What new lesson will I learn? It's a very different perspective to have. And of course, it's not something which we can do immediately with the most difficult of parts of our lives, but it's a kind of practice that we can do with the smaller difficulties, or the emotional difficulties that come just when there's a difficult day or a difficult interaction with someone we're close to, or whatever. At a certain point, we even can be willing to help others. And then we enter the tradition of the bodhisattva in Buddhist tradition, the one who is willing to enter difficulties to help others. And there's a beautiful book that many of you know by Shantideva from the 8th century called A Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. And at one point he says in this text, because one loves to pacify the pains of others, one whose mind is attuned in this way would enter even the deepest hell, just as a wild goose plunges into a lotus pool. Would enter even the deepest of hells, just as a wild goose plunges into a lotus pool. That's sort of the far horizon of our practice, but it's good to have that in mind. And yet, if we are entering difficulties, the obvious danger is that we will lose balance at times. And of course, we constantly lose balance. And I often like to think of our practice as sort of like getting lost, getting found. We could say that we're a meeting of the lost and found department here in some way. That we're constantly, and it's okay to get lost. That's what we do in our practice. We set ourselves up so we get lost, but then we have the potential to find ourselves. And one of the ways that we can get unbalanced is that the suffering becomes overwhelming. And I think sometimes then it may not be the best thing to say, okay, I'm going to work with it. I'm really going to work with the suffering. Sometimes it's better than to apply the antidote. That's where we can talk about the cultivation of joy. Because I think in our practice it becomes an art form where we have to know sometimes, is it better to go right into the stuff that's there, or is it better to apply the antidote? There's no easy answers to that question. But in some ways the antidote to the suffering of being lost is that cultivation of the joy, of the open and warm heart that's appreciative of life. And it's a quality, this quality of cultivating joy, I think is really, really crucial. And we kind of live in a society which in some ways takes our natural joy, which we often experience as children, and we tend to lose it as we get older. Have you noticed? Why do we lose it? We tend to become more rigid, concerned with doing things a certain way, or we get very pressured and busy. The culture is super busy. It's very hard to be joyful if we're overworked. I think many of us know that one. And then, of course, there's the pressure to always have a happy face, to not go into difficulties, which I think actually suppresses joy. But there's something about the ability to go into difficulties, which, as I was saying earlier, makes possible joy. And then there's also the superego, the familiar self-judgmental voice, which actually makes joy very difficult. Until we've worked with that self-judgmental voice a lot, joy is sometimes hard to find. So for me, joy has been really important in my practice. I remember one time when I was doing a longer retreat of about 3 months. I was doing kind of a solo retreat. I was in England at Gaia House. Some of you may know, working with Christopher Titmuss and Christina Feldman. Some of you know them as teachers. And I was doing concentration practice, and I was going to kind of a deeper level of solitude. And it was kind of symbolized by the fact that after a while, I was living in a small cottage, and I was only talking to someone like every 4 days. And I was eating my meals at the retreat center, which was just, as part of the retreat center, about a little cottage sort of on the outskirts of the retreat center. and I was eating my meals with the people who would be doing the retreats. At a certain point I said, I will eat my meals alone. And it seemed to cross the threshold which brought up fear of increased solitude in my mind and heart. And I started finding myself. I would get my food and bring it back to this little cottage, and it was kind of interesting because there weren't any thoughts in my mind. I don't want to do this. It just started to manifest in my body. My body started getting incredibly heavy. And I'd been about a month into the retreat, so I was very concentrated, but I was getting very heavy, and I started feeling nauseous all the time. Sort of heavy and nauseous. And this just kept on going for several days. And then I had an interview. I was like a few days from I would have like a 15-minute interview every 4 days. That was my social life. And aside from communing with the compost pile, which is my work. And I talked to Christopher Titmus, and I said, I'm feeling really heavy, and he asked me a question about, think of the model of the 7 factors of awakening and what's not present. And I looked down the list, and one of them is more or less joy and rapture. And I said, there's no joy. There's nothing like that. And he said, well, why don't you do what would bring about joy? And I said, oh, good. And I said, what would bring about joy in that instance was actually, I knew that there was something about the eating alone that had crossed a line. And so I went back and ate with the group, and I stopped doing such long meditations. I just went around looking at flowers and spider webs and so forth all day long, and all of a sudden I was just smiling and happy and full of joy. And it was very interesting how that could balance out. Actually, the story continues because then I was really kind of proud of myself for being capable of being joyful. Oh, I'm such a good meditator. I know how to be joyful. And you know how it is when you meditate, especially when you do retreats. The self-inflation gets ridiculous at times. And then a few days later, I talked with Christina Feldman, and she said, "Oh, it sounds really good. You've been able to contact your joy, but what about that nausea? What about that?" And I said, "Right." And she encouraged me actually to go back. This is kind of a balancing of the going into being with joy, and then after a few days, she said, "Why don't you go back into what was really difficult for you?" And I said, "Good idea." But I wasn't terribly enthusiastic, and I said, "Yes, well, I'll do it." And I think we had a morning meeting, and I said, "I'll do it," but because I knew I'd be triggered by the meal, and I decided. I said, "I'll do it, but not for lunch. I'll do it for dinner." And I started postponing it a bit, and I kind of got myself all together and tried to work with the resources of the joy and gave myself pep talks and read, fancied myself a great spiritual warrior. I got it all together, and then went and got my meal for dinner and sat down, waited for the waves of nausea and all that to come, and nothing ever happened. And I ate my meals in solitude for another 2 months, and nothing ever happened. Which was, I think it was something about being willing at that moment to face my demons, and they just left. They just left at that moment. You know that story? You know that lesson in your own lives? That quality. Sometimes when I was willing to face it, I was all ready for something, and nothing ever happened. I just was able to be with it like that. So there's something about the joy, though, which is a quality that we can cultivate, and that becomes something that we can know more as something that's really part of our nature. Because I think that joy is part of our inherent nature when we're at rest. I think that's why we find it in children. And there's, the Hindus talk about Sat Chit Ananda. Ananda is joy or bliss, and it's taken to be part of our core nature. That joy is really present. In a way, joy is something that we touch when we go deep enough into our nature. And I know one of the powerful experiences that I've had is on retreat particularly, but also in daily life, is sometimes finding that there can be a joy which is with anything that happens. And I remember one retreat, I was particularly startled because one morning I hadn't slept well, I was irritable, I wasn't particularly concentrated, and I was just so happy. There was joy even when the presenting experiences were that which would usually make me not very happy. There was something that was being touched just about the joy. For me, I think it was the joy of just focusing on being present and on finding refuge in that practice, which brought out a certain kind of joy that was almost independent of what was happening. That it was there even with sort of unpleasant experiences. And I think that's the kind of joy which we can tap into, which I think many of us know, that there's simply a joy of being, which when our minds and hearts are at rest, joy is there. There's a beautiful poem by an Eskimo shaman which goes like this: "The great sea has sent me adrift. It moves me as the weed in a great river. Earth and the great weather move me, have carried me away, and move my inward parts with joy." There's a kind of communion with life, with being part of things, which that shaman, she experiences that as joy. Just the joy of presence. And one of the most amazing expressions of this for me has been an expression of that joy in the midst of difficulty. I was asking that question, what does it look like when we have the ability both to enter into difficulties and to express joy? And one of the expressions of this is by a woman named Etty Hillesum. I brought this book in called An Interrupted Life. The Diaries of Etty Hillesum, 1941 to 1943. A Dutch Jewish woman who eventually died in Auschwitz. And she kept this journal, which is really a journal of spiritual transformation. She started off as a fairly superficial young woman, I think probably mid-late 20s. And for whatever reasons, the situation and her friends, there was an incredible deepening. She eventually chose to go with her community to the transit camps in Holland and eventually to Auschwitz. But people wanted her to escape, and there were escape plans, and she chose to stay with the community. And she kept this journal the whole time, and there are letters from the transit camps, and she talks about this quality of joy even in the midst of a lot of suffering. The transit camps in Holland were not death camps, but there was still a lot of suffering. And she said this: "The misery here is quite terrible, and yet late at night when the day has slunk away into the depths behind me, I often walk with a spring in my step along the barbed wire, and then time and time again it soars straight from my heart. I can't help it, that's just the way it is, like some elementary force. The feeling that life is glorious and magnificent, and that one day we shall be building a whole new world. Against every new outrage and every fresh horror, we shall put up one more piece of love and goodness, drawing strength from within ourselves." It's a very extraordinary statement. And this book is an awesome testimony. So there's a quality that we can have joy even when things are difficult. And one of my neighbors and a friend is Houston Smith, who some of you know, who is a great scholar of comparative religion, and he's 85 now. And he walks, his hip is really bad, so he walks with a walker. And I was talking with him recently, and he was talking about how it was important for him to really show to show and feel a kind of dignity amidst limitation. That's what he said is sort of the spiritual challenge of aging. It's to show a beauty. In other words, for him it was kind of an affirmation of the whole process. Not saying, oh yeah, now that I'm 85, I'm just should be tossed on the slag heap or whatever. You're saying, no, I'm affirming the whole cycle. This has a place, and it's my spiritual challenge at 85 with a really bad hip to accept this with dignity and awareness of limitation as part of the process. To me, this is a kind of cultivation of joy while recognizing difficulty and limitation. I think this is actually one of the most poignant themes in a lot of the great spiritual literature that we find. Think of the African American spirituals and the blues. What are they if not an evocation of joy from amidst difficulty? So I think I'll just end with a poem. Let's see where it is. Which I think is about this. It's a little bit... I think this is about the quality of joy coming out of having faced difficulties. This is part of a poem by Mary Oliver. For years and years I struggled just to love my life. And then the butterfly rose, weightless in the wind. Don't love your life too much, it said, and vanished into the world. I'll read that one more time. For years and years, this is not one of these completely straightforward, the meaning is obvious poems. So. For years and years, I struggled just to love my life. And then the butterfly rose, weightless in the wind. Don't love your life too much, it said, and vanished into the world. So, thank you. Please.
Do you have any comments on gratitude and grace?
Gratitude is a practice that we probably don't do quite enough. And I think, again, it's good to see it in balance and even to ask personally, what am I good at? Am I really good at going into suffering and difficulties? Well, then gratitude is probably a good practice, as is the cultivation of joy. I know for myself, I'm probably temperamentally inclined to focus on difficulties. Some of you may be similar. I don't know whether it's from having a Jewish upbringing with, stories of suffering and all this continually. But I know when I've done gratitude practice, it's really been great. It's really been great. It really touches something that feels like it's wanting to be expressed. And so gratitude practice can be done really simply, just by focusing on what one's grateful for. And it's not a, sometimes we may think of that as a kind of Pollyannish type of effort, but I think it's really, if we know that we're going into the difficulties and the suffering, then I think these other practices are incredibly important, because we really easily get unbalanced, don't we? I know I do. We really get unbalanced with sometimes looking at the negative, and these other practices are really, really crucial. The gratitude practices for appreciating and tuning in maybe to what we could call the grace of things, that which has been really fortunate, a friend, a teacher, certain aspects of our lives. Does that help some? Okay.
I'm grateful for that.
Yeah. Does anyone here have gratitude practices that you do that you might want to share with the group? Please.
Well, I do that a lot, especially if I stub my toes. I try to thank the universe.
Yeah. Please.
It's a little challenging, but I want to tell a little story that indicates that it's all although embracing these contradictions are kind of obvious with the Buddhist practice, they're never easy.
Yeah.
And recently I've had cause to be in touch with some folks who do liberation theology, and it's resonates quite exactly with what you were just saying. And perhaps it's more prescriptive politically because of its connection with Marxism. And finding gratitude and grace with the most humble and the most abused by our society is what they say is the way towards salvation. True grace, true salvation comes only from the poorest of the poor and so on. So I had the chance to be with this, he was a Jesuit priest, a gay man, in Managua, Nicaragua, and he brought us around Managua, and it was clear he worked with street kids a lot, because wherever we stopped, they'd come out, Chepe, and they'd all scream, you'd have this big group of kids around. And there was one kid who was so excited, and he kept trying to give us a bag, a paper bag, which he would inhale, and sniffing glue was quite the rage among street kids who can't handle poverty or whatever. And it was very odd to be offered this out of, he was trying to share with us what he had just found. Oh, sniff this with us. It was very challenging to find gratitude, grace, and all of this in that moment. There was a joy there that was painful.
Yeah. Thank you. Please.
I can very much relate to that. Grace is gratitude of the practice. Part of my practice for a long time, I consider them to be, timeless absolutes for no better description. One of the things I would be most grateful for would be the teachings. Some of the teachings I simply haven't liked the form in which they come. However, some of the strongest and most wonderful teachers that lead me to greater depths or heights or whatever of gratitude have been horror, for example. Just the horror of the world. What I've seen horror in my own life. I can genuinely sit here and say, thank you. Thank you for that teaching. It enriched my life. It leads me toward compassion. So gratitude and grace are the kind of things that I tremble about. I think that's all there is in a way. That we drop out of Dharmakaya as an act of grace and of gratitude. It's hardly my idea, Even our quantum mechanics folks are telling us approximately the same thing. There's a ripple in nothing. And that ripple in nothing is grace. And out of that ripple comes everything. Absolutely everything. Including the worst things that you can possibly imagine. If you're going to have the best of duality, you've got to handle the worst too. So I've been very... why is it that Amazing Grace is such a popular stuff?
I mean, I love the way that what you're pointing to is that connection between suffering and learning. The fact that the difficulties, whether they're personal or collective, just invite us to learn something very deep.
Pain is grace.
Yeah, I mean, it's, again, not what we were brought up with. Although I guess in some ways it's deep in the Western traditions,
Well, pain implies there's somebody there. There's an ego in a sense. Someone can feel it. Grace takes you beyond that. All there is grace.
But it might be to contemplate some of your deepest learnings and the relationship to difficult experiences. Please.
Well, then if you wrote an article for Tricycle about the current situation, and politically, how does one treat the war in Iraq as something to be grateful for? How does one learn from what's going on now?
I didn't expound at great length on that topic, but and I think it's in the context of my talk, I think it's really important to not be very flip with any of these subjects, and it's really to have that balance, to know, have you gone into the difficulty and the suffering, then maybe you can talk about the grace of this. But I think it's from an intellectual point of view, it's possible to see this war as contributing to the playing out of certain outdated ways of thinking. We can think like that, we can see that, and maybe intellectually that can make some sense. I think it's that has to be really connected with compassion, or it can become overly distanced, I think. I think that's important. But yeah, one can, there's this huge drama. One of the things that I did write about in that piece was that it's really helpful to learn to see the social and political events of the world through what I call Dharma eyes, to see the phenomena as in, and this is really I think what you were reflecting on, within the drama of liberation. And I don't mean the liberation of Iraq, but the liberation of the heart. And to be able to see those phenomena and look at them and see that, to see the causes of these phenomena particularly in greed, hatred, and delusion. I think it's no phenomena are totally greed, hatred, and delusion. There's always some insight or maybe some goodwill. Maybe it's small in this example. Do you know what I'm saying?
Well, any experience of suffering to some degree is a lesson about Maya. So, we can be grateful for that. I can be grateful for that in that sort of generalized way. I guess, hearing people talking about grace and gratitude, I find myself in this situation not centered around it. To say that this whole display of war and suffering is merely for my edification seems just facile.
It's hard. On the other hand, you have to ask the question: what makes people wake up? What makes people wake up out of just deluded self-centeredness? And it's not what my own preferred way of having the world work would be, to say that we do seem to wake up out of certain delusions, especially when there's a lot of suffering. How did Europe escape centuries and centuries of nationalism? As it seems to have happened now to a large extent, out of the worst suffering you could imagine. That just seems to be true, and it's so we can look at these phenomena that way. Again, it's the hope is that we can wake up without so much suffering. And we always want to give options for that. But it's just to be very direct. There is this link between suffering, including outward suffering, social suffering, and waking up. So I'm sorry to say that, but that's what my eyes tell me.
Well, and that would fit with the temperament of going after difficult things.
Yeah. So maybe we can hold that larger situation. To me, what this calls for, and something that really I am very passionate about, is that I think we live in pretty unstable times. And to me, what's called for are for all of you to become further enhanced bodhisattvas, who are really dedicated, who know that we're living in a period which is transitional, in which it's likely there'll be a lot more suffering, and there's an incredible role for people who have internalized the teachings and who are really dedicated to both personal awakening and helping with the collective. I think it's really, really crucial now. One of the things that I'm actually doing now, hesitate to talk about it fully, but I'm actually shifting away from my graduate school teaching, and I want to try to develop a bodhisattva school, like more of a training for people who really feel called in that way, because I think that the times are really calling forth this kind of motivation.
Please. I I'm not that long out of 5 months of going through chemotherapy and cancer challenge and whatever, and I'm kind of amazed at how positive an experience it has been, even in the midst of doing it.
Yeah.
And I look at some pictures of myself and just how large and bad and in bad shape I was and things like that. But it opened me up. And the equality on the cancer ward and in the cancer clinic, and the ease by which it is to have conversations, really human conversations with people that just open up so easily. It's a lot more difficult to talk over the cake here than it is in the cancer clinic. And I bless that. I just think it's kind of amazing and very, very special. And I don't know why. I'm grateful for this. I don't know why, but I seem to have an ability to kind of look at the sunny side of whatever it is that I'm going through, which is not to say that I'm not also Jewishly drawn to the difficulties and, what's going to happen. Oh my God, it's like I'm through this, but what's going to pop up somewhere, and I find it odd that when I've talked to people, even some people with cancer or whatever, they say, well, you can do that, but I can't.
Yeah.
And I think anybody can do it, and it's from the minimal Buddhist teachings I know, it's so unbelievable to kind of be able to turn that around. Take that what is suffering as just an opening and a life learning it's been a wonderful thing, and I'm enormously grateful for the experience.
Tell me your name again.
Larry.
Larry, could you say maybe what do you think are 2 or 3 ways, or 2 or 3 approaches or perspectives, or what really has helped you with that transition, with that kind of learning, given that you say other people don't necessarily do that?
I guess one thing that I did, and I seem to be able to do, is accept what's happening in the moment. And, it is what it is. It made me really understand the Holocaust a lot better, because as my cancer got worse, I was amazed with what I could put up with, just thinking that I had this kind of holistic thing that, like, the pimple gets bigger and bigger and bigger until it pops. So the fact that I was the biggest tumor that ever walked through their door, that they shared with me at some point, I didn't have that perspective. I just thought, this thing's heading towards some kind of resolution or healing or something. And I certainly had hope that things would move to a better place, and they seem to have, as far as I can tell. But there were just different bumps in the road, and I guess acceptance.
And it sounds like maybe being careful with the voices and stories in your mind, right?
Yeah, I had a really big tumor that ended up dead at the end of all the chemo that had to be taken off my neck.
Yeah.
And one of the things the surgeon is supposed to do, which could easily terrorize you, is tell you every bad thing that could possibly happen. We're going to cut your nerves. You're never going to be able to raise your arm over your head. And then the operation was going to happen like 7 days later. And I just thought, either I can compulse over all the things that are going to go wrong, or I could just kind of live my life today and not decide to go nuts. And I was able to do that, which, again, I'm not quite sure how. I think it has to do with, you talked at the very beginning of your talk about, like, you go, I know I'm losing it.
Yeah.
And when you kind of see that you're losing it, you can kind of rest, meditate, breathe, whatever it takes to kind of bring it back. And that kept me out of a lot of that kind of futuristic kind of fear. And now, I can't believe the gratitude that I feel toward the oncology doctors and the surgeons and stuff. And these are people that I used to revile when I was successful with my holistic healing of the same issue.
Yeah. So there are ways that we can see our ordinary practice as training for that kind of extreme circumstance. That there's a way in which what we do in this practice is we train to be in the present moment. We train to watch when we're a little bit off balance, how our minds start getting activated and they work in certain ways. We train to come back to the present moment. We train to take, our moments of suffering as instances to study how our minds work and how our hearts work and how we get lost. That's what this practice is in part about. I think the sort of the investigation of difficulties is the exhaustive study, and exhaustive in both general senses of comprehensive and exhausting. It's the exhaustive study of how we get lost. That's what our practice is in part about. And then there's that opening to the joy and the peace. That could be a summary of what I was talking about today. But that's what we do with our practice. We just study, we look for when we're out of balance, and we say, let me look at this. Let me explore this. So that we get to know our patterns so well that if they're not helpful, they drop away. That's how the practice works. It works by looking at things over and over and over again, so exhaustively that we know them really well. They're not, they don't sneak up on us in the same way. We know from a moment, looks like Donald's story about, woe is me, my woe is me number 13 story is activating. I'm aware of that. Do I want to go that way? No, not today. Thank you. Bye, woe is me story number 13. That's enough. Bye. And and practice can work like that. Not so easily at the start like that, but just by looking at it over and over again. That's why we sit. I think I don't need to tell you maybe, but that's why we sit. That's what this practice. That's why we just sit here, doing externally nothing. We just sit and we watch that stuff, and we watch our minds work when different things happen. That's why we do this, and then we try to carry it out into our daily lives. That's what mindfulness practice is. In some ways, that's all it is.
We should wrap up here.
Okay.
Can Snake ask you a question you have to formally?
Yeah. Okay. That's right.
Some people want it down. So thank you very much, Tom.
You're welcome.
If the Buddhist Peace Fellowship does anything in terms of sessions other than a spirit rock treatment to the dynamic and how to keep it together during the election, that would be helpful.
There's a group called Spirited Action that some of you know about, which has had some meetings. Had a meeting yesterday, and look it up on the webpage. Spirited Action, and they're trying to bring together people, particularly Buddhist practitioners, around the election. There was a meeting in Berkeley in April, which was really fun. 600 people were there. So it's really, look up Spirited Action, or look at the Buddhist Peace Fellowship webpage. Those would be the good reference points, because I know there are things in the works that will be happening.
Are there any other announcements? Cass is our host, and he made a beautiful cake.
Yeah, check out his cake. Yeah. Well, please stay and devour it. Enjoy the fellowship of the Sangha. There's tea as well. If you have tea, please wash your cup. There's a dana bowl. We request that you contribute what you can. The $5 is a suggestion, but decide for yourself. And
Did you use the announcement?
Yeah, were you through?
yes, I am.
Just a few flyers. I have a flyer for the retreat in September on meditation in action at Spirit Rock with Diana Winston. And it'll be about half silence, about half interactive, and particularly we'll be giving skills for bringing sort of a social consciousness into action in one's life. That's really the intention. And I'm doing a few day-longs in July, and I have them on a flyer here. One of them is on July 25th at Spirit Rock on the theme of working with judgments. A favorite theme of mine. And then kind of the balancing thing at the Redwood City Meditation Center, which if you haven't gone is really a great place. I'm doing a day-long retreat on the 31st on loving-kindness practice. So the information on, if you want that, is right here. If you want to just take one of these, that'd be fine. I brought a few Spirit Rock brochures and also some from the center in Redwood City. And just one of my own main mentors has been John Travis. And if you're looking for a summer retreat, he's doing a great 9-day retreat in the High Sierra at the end of July. So I'll leave that flyer here.
Marty, yeah, I want to remind everybody that the potluck this month is at my place. Plenty of parking, it's easy to park, there's no excuses not to come. It's not a turkey. We're going to try to do a cookout, so bring something to grill or something picnicky, I guess.
This is a flyer.
Okay, flyer outside.
Is that what you did? You have that?
That was it.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, well, the closed, something you want to lead us in closing, or we can read the dedication of merit?
I'll lead in a dedication of merit.
You can stand in a circle. Okay.
So first, just being present to one's body, to the group. First being aware, is there an intention which comes out of the session today? An intention for your life, for your practice that you want to follow from the exploration that we carried out on entering difficulty and cultivating joy. So on this day for so many people it is a celebration, really, and emphasizing the joyful aspects. We dedicate what's been helpful and fruitful from this morning. We freely give it away to others in the world. We dedicate the fruits, the learning, the insight, the goodwill to all beings, knowing that we practice together, we practice for others. May our time together be a force for the awakening of all beings.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.